Oh my goodness. I'm going to start now. Sorry about that. Whoever wasn't here missed all this. Clement of Alexandria says that Matthew spent 15 years with the Hebrews and then went to the Ethiopians, the Greeks of Macedonia, the Syrians, and the Persians. Okay? And she'll have to be, right?
She'll get all of our viewpoints on it.
Okay. Proof of authorship. Again, we have to go to external evidence. Papias from AD 60 to 150 give us background on Matthew's gospel, a translation of an earlier document written in Hebrew and Aramaic by the Apostle Matthew. Irenaeus stated that Matthew wrote the original document while Peter and Paul were preaching in Rome. Eusebius, AD 260 to 340, says that Matthew committed to write the gospel that he had preached. Jerome, AD 340 to 420, verified all of this but was uncertain who had translated it into Greek. This evidence gives positive and uniform support from the early church fathers that Matthew is indeed the author. And the time of the writing is between AD 55 and 69. Now, let's just talk for a minute about internal evidence. We didn't deal with internal evidence in regard to whether or not Matthew wrote the book. But there is internal evidence used to determine the years of the writing. Now, there's a big span, 14-year span. But I'm just showing you how internal evidence works. Why did they only go up to 69 and not go into the 70s? Talking about internal evidence. Because something happened in AD 70. What happened in AD 70, you church historians? Jerusalem was sacked and burned. And internal evidence says if that had happened, it would have shown up in the book. So the book was written before that happened because that was such a climactic, significant event in Israel that it would have been mentioned. And it's not mentioned. So the assumption is this had to have been written before AD 70. And so AD 55 to 69. I just shared that with you to show you how internal evidence for things works. When you know something happened at a certain time that you know the writer would have included, had it have already happened, then you can conclude that the book had to have been written prior to that time. Because even if it wasn't important to the audience, it would have been important to the writer. Okay. Proof. So that's some of your proof of authorship. Let's talk about the characteristics and purpose of Matthew. It was clearly written to Jews. Matthew was written to Jews, and therefore it gives the genealogy of Jesus. Why? You wanted to prove that he was Jewish. You wanted to prove that he came through the Jewish line. If you're trying to convert Jewish people, you're going to deal with the genealogy of Jesus if you want them to believe that he's the Messiah. And this also explains why it has the first position in the New Testament. because it is full of fulfilled prophecy, and it's trying to reach a Jewish audience. And therefore, it's the first book in the New Testament. We don't think it was the first book written, but it's the first book in the New Testament because of the Jewish the Jewish references and the Jewish audience. It stresses the relationship of Jesus to the Jewish faith. It showed that Jesus fulfilled many of the Old Testament prophecies that were foretold of the Messiah. It deals a lot with the Old Testament prophecies about the Messiah that Jesus fulfilled. Why? It was trying to convert the Jewish person. Matthew quotes more often from the Old Testament prophets than any other of the synoptic writers. He emphasizes Jesus' teaching ministry. And this gospel is often called the teaching gospel. Mark's was the action gospel. This is the teaching gospel due to its content. So they were looking for the Messiah. What were they looking for in the Messiah? They were looking for an earthly king to rule on the throne of David and restore Israel's political power. They were looking for someone who would defeat the Romans, ruling from Jerusalem with the glory of Solomon. That's what the Jews were looking for. And since Jesus did not come in this way, the Jews did not recognize him as the Messiah. And this was a key element for their salvation. It had to be by faith. And it was going to take faith for a Jewish person to believe that he was the Messiah when he did not do what they thought he was supposed to come to do. Many rejected him because they rejected God who had sent him. And their hearts were closed and full of unbelief, and they could not hear or comprehend the one they looked for. Any questions or comments or thoughts on Mark or Matthew? Are you already beginning to see why they used different stories? They used different parts of the same story. They chose their material well for their audience. And they emphasized what they knew would be the most beneficial to the audience they were trying to reach. And therefore, it looks like some of the stuff is contradictory. Contradictory at worst and insufficient, incomplete at best. But they had their certain, well, let me say it this way. The Holy Spirit had a certain audience in mind with each of the gospels that were written. And they were written specifically to reach that type of people. So it's important that you know the audience. It's important that you know the time. And it's important that you understand how to what's the word I want? I'm trying to get the right word. Not compare, but
Exegete.
not exegete. What's the word I'm trying? Anyway, you complement one for the other rather than make them contradictory. Okay, and it's important that we do that. It's important that we do that for the hearers, for the people we're talking to, because they will ask questions like, "Why did one gospel writer say this, and another gospel writer seemed to contradict him?" It wasn't contradiction. It was just the audience and it was just the way in which they said it. No questions, no comments, no yawns. Are you guys tired? Nah. Tired or sick? I can tell there's a little bit of sickness going on tonight. Yeah. Well, I'm glad you're here. If you hadn't have been, you wouldn't have got the recording. So, okay, we're going to call it a night. And we got started. We'll do Luke and John. Well, at least do Luke. I'm not sure if I'll do John or not. We'll see. And then we'll get into the life of Christ. Good night, everybody.